Thank you very
Thank
much,
you.
Anna, for such a nice introduction. I'm very honored to be here today. It's been a long time since, one, I've gotten to talk about GEOBIA, and two, since I've taught a class. I'm not teaching this semester, so this will be exciting for all of us. I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully everybody has the Saga software opened already. Let's see, share screen, simple enough. There we go. Hopefully you can see slides, PowerPoint slides with the title on them.
Okay. Yes, we can see it.
Awesome. And I will show you, if you haven't ever dealt with Saga before, it can be a little bit confusing to get everything started. So wherever you downloaded and unzip the files at, everything comes together. You don't actually have to install anything. There's this saga GUI.exe, and if you just click on that, it'll open the software. Mine's going to open in the wrong window, of course, so I'll have to move it. But one second. Okay, so this is the software that we'll be using today. I did create slides, and we'll go through the slides. Then as we get through a concept, then we'll switch over to the software, so that way it's kind of a back and forth. I also sent out the PDF that has specific instructions on handling Saga for object-based image analysis. I do want to preface that I typically don't use Saga. I've adapted to using it for doing some of my teaching because the licenses for the more traditional e-cognition is ridiculously expensive and not affordable to most people. So if you open Saga, you can just leave it like this for now, and we'll get back to it in a minute. But let me get back. Oops, present. Okay. So I thought today what we would do is kind of start at a very base level, talking about what object-based image analysis is, and then look at a specific case study that I know really well, and walk you through the analysis and kind of go over some of the shortcomings of using Saga, but some of the possibilities as well. So to get started, kind of an overview. First, I'd like to talk about what is all the fuss. Why is GEOBIA something that is really picked up in popularity in the last, I don't know, 5 years or so, 10 years? And then we'll start talking about the actual process of object-based image analysis and how it differs from typical or traditional pixel-based analysis. And then we'll conclude kind of with a summary and overview of the different types of software that we can use to do object-based image analysis. As I said, we'll use Saga, but there's a number of other both open source and proprietary software available for doing object-based image analysis. So as with all remote sensing science or Earth observation science, technology really drives the methods that we use. We can see I went to Google Ngrams and just did a quick search to see the popularity of the term GEOBIA. And you can see in between 2000 and now it's really kind of taken off. And along with that, we can also see that the sensor resolutions that we have available to us have really become sharper. So in 1999, the ICANO satellite was launched. It created a great stir within the Earth observation community because it's a 4-meter multispectral and a 1-meter panchromatic sensor. And it really opened up the possibilities for high-resolution remote sensing and object-based or object detection, object-based image analysis. In 2000, the probably most common object-based image analysis tool called eCognition was launched. Prior to that, it had been originally developed within the medical image analysis community and was then brought into geospatial by a company called Definions. It was later bought out by Trimble, which I think most people have heard the term Trimble if you know anything about GPS or GIS technologies. And then most recently, or throughout that same time, I guess, we've also seen increases in the spatial resolution of imagery. So as I talked about, ICONOS really coming in at the 4-meter level back in 1999. In 2016, we had WorldView 4 launched with a 1.24 meters multispectral camera. And we can't leave out the use of drones, where we have a lot more flexibility in capturing very high resolution imagery, depending on the heights that we're flying our sensors. So along with all those innovations, we've also seen development of new techniques. And object-based image analysis really is seeing growth itself due to those technological changes. So what's all the fuss? In object-based image analysis, our goal is to extract objects from high-resolution imagery. In traditional pixel-based sensing, let's say we're using Landsat or other coarser resolution image products, oftentimes we can't resolve at the object level. Instead, we're looking at spectral patterns or large regional landscape patterns, maybe forest stands, for example. With higher resolution imagery, then, we're able to resolve objects. And in fact, we see this relationship where we have objects comprised of multiple pixels instead of a pixel comprised of multiple objects, like we see with Landsat, for example. Object-based image analysis, because we're looking at that object level, also gives us the ability to study relationships between objects and integrate that into our analysis workflow. So for example, if we were to extract building footprints, we're able to look at the relationships of different building footprints to the roadways, the road networks around them, and use the objects themselves as representations of spatial relationships. Because we're looking at objects and compartmentalizing space in that way, it gives us a more robust method for understanding spatial relations. As we move down this list, we get closer towards kind of the things that I studied in my dissertation. So I studied human interpretation of remote sensing imagery and the environment. And my research looked at how do we understand change as a process, both visually through images and also through time series slices or time series graphs. And to understand that, we need to understand that humans ingest information visually and then conceptualize it and reflect on it in relationship to their prior knowledge. So what we understand in the landscape is some combination of perception and conception or conceptualization. And so this idea that humans make the knowledge or derive knowledge from remote sensing data really is kind of structure the way that I approach image analysis. And object-based image analysis is very useful for connecting those mechanistic or computational methods to human interpretation. And that's because of this idea of objects and our ability also to use something called rule-based classification. So rule-based classification, if you're familiar with decision trees, for example, it's related to that. So we can use expert knowledge to design rules that help us divide an image slowly, not slowly, but stepwise through a process based on the properties of that image. So there's a lot of neat things that GEOBIA is able to do. And we'll look at a couple of ways to use that in this talk today. So I wanted to start off with image interpretation. It's something I hope everybody is familiar with. It's my favorite part of being a geographer, really, is understanding how we use the image interpretation elements to understand the environment around us. So back in 1960, Charles Olson published a paper called the Image Interpretation Elements. And in this paper, he drew on 9 different elements he thought were useful for the interpretation of aerial images. And you can see those listed there. A couple of them aren't on there because they've become outdated. Tone, for example, isn't on there. So we can use these different elements to make sense of the images on the right. So if we look at the first image there on the upper left-hand corner, we can see some sort of a building with a very, to me, familiar shape. I think if anybody is interested in football, whether it's American football or international football, you might recognize a stadium shape. We can also tell its size by the size of the building versus the trees around it. You can see the trees are very small compared to the giant building. And then if we look at the next image on the upper right-hand side there, we see a mixture of greens and variations in texture. And if you look at the variations in texture, you can see different species of trees. So we have deciduous trees, are kind of the trees there that have a very fine texture. They also don't have green leaves on them at that point in time. And then we see the other trees there that are green and plush and kind of cuddly looking almost. And so we can use these same attributes in urban settings as well. On the bottom there, you can see patterns of row houses in New York. You can see the long rectangular buildings in this image here on the lower left side and see the different sizes that are there. You can see across the street that the buildings are different shapes and have different properties altogether. And so from that information, you can infer that it's probably a residential area on the north side or the upper side of that image. And then this is either, if I remember correctly, it was a school building on the lower side. I thought the next image, the lower right-hand side, was another interesting example. So you can see the color yellow on the cars there. And anybody that's been to New York or has seen a movie that has New York in it knows that yellow taxi cabs are kind of what New York is known for. If you scroll through the Google Earth imagery of New York and Manhattan, you see those yellow cars all over the place. So just some examples where we're using these elements to infer information about the environment around us. In all of these cases, they're all color images, and it tends to be that when we're doing these interpretations, color is one of the things that we would really draw on first. So what does it look like then if we're to use those types of properties in image analysis? Well, on the left side here, you can see an agricultural region and agricultural fields shown with a false color composite set of bands so that the agricultural fields are bright pink. And we can use the properties of those fields and of the spectral properties as well as the shape properties of those fields to get something that looks like the right-hand side. And on the right-hand side, what we see is a segmented image of that same region. And if we were to take this one step further, we could use the properties of those individual fields to compute all kinds of different schemes. If you're interested in the types of crops, perhaps, or the wetness, you could classify those based on that. The real power of GEOBIA is that we don't have to rely on the spectral information. So the spectral variation or the tonal differences between the pink colors there, we can integrate the spatial characteristics. So how square those plots are or how large they are. So for example, if we had a certain crop that was grown on acres that were on plots that were much larger than other plots, it would be possible to differentiate between those in object-based image analysis rather easily. So the general process of object-based image analysis really isn't much different from pixel-based image analysis. The biggest difference is that process of segmentation that we just looked at. The results after you segmented your image is classification, and it's that classification process where we start to see some variations in what our outcomes are. The typical output is what we would see with a pixel-based image analysis, a wall-to-wall map, something like land use and land cover, a thematic map with different categories in it. We can also do something that is a little bit different, so we can do entity detection. So for example, in this image here, you might not be able to tell exactly what it is, but we have trees at a spatial resolution with imagery, UAS imagery of a spatial resolution of about 5 centimeters. And each one of these points that are triangles are trees. So our object-based image analysis process, we first extracted the polygons and classified them as tree or not tree, and then we're able to use just a polygon to point translation to pick out the trees. We could also do entity delineation, so that would be the crowns of the trees. You can see here crown wasn't really successful as a metric for this imagery. One of the limitations, I guess, of using UAS is there's really limited spectral information. And in this case, we didn't use LiDAR or SFM capabilities to pull out those tree crowns. And you're looking at, I mean, on an order of 5 centimeters, most of these trees were probably waist high to knee high, not very large trees at all. So the fact that we could get any of these crowns to come out compared to the other vegetation around them was pretty good. So with each of these different types of outputs comes different methods of analysis. It also comes with different methods of accuracy assessment, and we'll talk about that later on. So when we talk about objects, I've been using the term objects, but I haven't really defined what an object is. And for geographic object-based image analysis, an object is both spectrally homogeneous and spatially contiguous. So for example, the cars, we could extract cars. We might extract something that let's say a dry patch in a field, so maybe somewhere where the sprinkler is mixed, something like that. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a physical object. It can still be a region, something with invisible boundaries. But what we're looking for really is that spectral homogeneity and the continuity of the pixels themselves. We typically describe objects as either being fiat, meaning they're a conceptualized object. So that dry spot, for example, is something that we conceptualize. It doesn't exist as an object really in and of itself, but we've determined that there's some boundary between wet and dry, and we've delineated that boundary. Another example would be counties or states, political boundaries. Those don't exist in physical reality. They exist as things that humans have kind of implemented themselves. And in contrast to that, we have something called bona fide objects. And these are your physical objects. So something like a donut or a tree, things like that that have a physical presence. When we derive objects, we have a number of quality parameters that we can think about. Excuse me. We want to find a high quality solution. So for example, we want to make sure that all of the objects that we want represented are represented. So high accuracy and precision. We want to make sure that the objects, so let's say we're looking at cars, for example, we want to make sure that the objects that we're extracting are similar in size. So for example, if we're extracting cars, we want a car as an object. We don't want some to be cars and some to be groups of cars all classified as an object. We'll talk about that a little bit more, I think, later on as well. It should be reproducible. This is really a difficult process if you're looking beyond the scope of a single scene. We'll talk about that when we get to the classification process. But especially when we use rule-based classification, transferability and reproducibility can become difficult depending on what stays the same. And I guess I kind of leaked over to universality or reproducibility, or transferability, sorry. So reproducible, if we use the same exact scene, the same exact data, and the same exact algorithms, can we get the same exact output? That'll vary a little bit if you're using randomization processes, but oftentimes you can implement methods that don't rely on optimization. So for that, things like seeded region growing, if we keep those seed starts the same and we don't randomize them, reproducibility becomes an option. The universality and the transferability problem comes in because of things like spectral variation. So when we have atmospheric interactions, haze, for example, or shadowing differences between images. I know there's shadows on my face, that's what made me think of that. Those can cause problems in the image analysis process. We saw that a lot with that tree example I gave earlier. And then finally, we want to optimize for speed. You'll see today, I think, depending on your computer processing capabilities, that object-based image analysis can be very slow, especially the segmentation the segment classification, because we have so many segments and they're a lot more complex structurally than the individual pixels that we see in pixel-based image analysis. So segmentation challenges, I already went over the first part. We have limited repeatability due to those different influences from whether it's haze and atmospheric constitution or things like seasonality and illumination and shadowing. It changes the way that the environment's illuminated, and for us as humans, we just understand that, but for computers it's a lot more difficult to get past that issue. In cases where you have for example, you're using a UAS or a drone image, the lack of spectral resolution, the lack of spectral resolution, so you might have a 3-band or 4-band image, makes it much more difficult to differentiate between objects in those types of images than if we have high spectral resolution. And then finally, something called the semantic gap. So if you look in this image here, this figure kind of walks us through what semantic gap is. And for a machine, when we give a machine a pixel, it has some spectral value associated with it. We segment that pixel or set of pixels into an object, and we have a number of characteristics. Those characteristics don't mean anything on their own. They're numbers. They're random numbers that have some physical value, but they don't have a semantic value. And so translation of information from spectral, texture, shape metrics into knowledge requires this kind of conceptual leap, and that's where humans come in. So understanding that this set of properties for that object mean that it's a tree versus it's a house, for example. Getting from that numeric representation to a semantic representation can be difficult at times. I know it's an area of active research for a number of different professions, including computer vision, medical imaging, and things like that. So it's not something that's just geography oriented. Something that you can do with object-based image analysis, this is something that I'm not completely sure can be done as elegantly in Saga as it can be done in more specialized software, is multi-scale analysis. So in eCognition, you're able to create multiple hierarchy layers like what you see in this image, and there's topological constraints between the levels of objects. So for example, you might have a level that are all of the individual trees, and all of those tree crowns might be delineated, kind of what you see on the fine level. Within eCognition, you're able to create another map on top of that or below that that keeps the spatial constraints of those object crowns, or the tree crowns as objects, and translate that into a coarser, finer resolution data set. So if you do an analysis where you pulled out a forest stand, and keep that as an informational layer, and then constrain your forest or your tree analysis within that spatial realm and preserve both up and down parent and child relationships as well as the spatial relationships. It's similar to if you had layers within GIS, but in GIS we don't necessarily preserve those parent-child relationships directly. If that makes sense. It's a little more nuanced way of thinking of hierarchies than what we do with like ArcGIS. In Saga, I haven't found anything that really achieves that. Trimble has really, the eCognition software has a lot more robust capabilities in that area. But it's something to think about if you were to do an analysis outside of Saga. You do have that ability to create multiple relationships in different dimensions, which is kind of cool. So let's talk about segmentation, and then we'll get into some of the software. That should be the longest period of me talking. So computer vision is where the roots of object-based image analysis come in. I'm going to scooch over a little bit so that way there's not so much shadow. And computer vision has long worked on this model of image segmentation and then classification. Geographic object-based image analysis, even though it's younger, really has taken it another step further by being able to integrate geographic concepts and spatial relationships. But the main components of GEOBIA are computer vision algorithms and things like that. Image segmentation can be kind of divided into 3 different families of techniques, even though there's thousands of different algorithms out there. We have threshold, region-based, and boundary-based techniques. Threshold is the simplest technique. This is just allocating pixels based on what range of values they are. And we'll look at examples of each of these in a minute. Region-based or similarity-based metrics are based on region growing. So I mentioned seeded region growing a few minutes ago. There are also other types like splitting and merging, but what happens is you kind of grow out instead of taking a threshold and just cutting. And then finally, boundary-based or discontinuity. In that case, we're looking at the spectral values and we're looking at sharp changes in those spectral values within an image. So to illustrate, this is an example of a threshold segmentation. You can see this isn't a geographic image. This is straight out of a computer vision textbook. And all we're doing is setting some threshold T, and all of the pixels that are above that value are one color, and all the pixels below that value are the other color. So in this case, the black values are below, I don't know, that's probably around 90 maybe, and all of the white pixels are above that value. Very simple, very effective, very quick, but maybe not as sophisticated as what we need for more complex images. Region growing algorithms, the reason that was highlighted in the previous slide was because that's the most popular method for object-based image analysis. It seems like every GEOBIA software has its own specialized region growing method. You can look up the white papers on them, but they all boil down to the same couple of parameters. So with the region growing algorithm, we start with some seed point. Typically that seed point is going to be either randomized, or you could technically start with your own seed points. So let's say you were looking at a tree crown map, for example, and maybe you know where those tree locations are. You could start with a point file and grow the regions from those points that you already know to get the crown cover. The three main parameters for a region growing algorithm are similarity. So similarity is going to look at the spectral similarity of pixels, how their luminance varies or does not vary. It's going to look at spatial proximity, and this is your compactness. So how compact should your objects be? In some cases, like the car example, you're going to have very compact, small objects if it's a city scene. And in other cases, let's say you're looking at landslide detection, for example. Landslides could be a variety of shapes, but they're going to be much larger than cars, for example. And then finally, size. So if you know that you're looking for a certain size object, you can sometimes specifically control the region growing based on that as well. You can also do that through the rule-based classification. If you're using that, you can use that as a constraint there as well. In addition to just region growing, you can also do region splitting and merging. So at this point, you'll start with whole regions and then split. Sometimes these types or merge based on the similarity of different regions. In some cases, this is used as a secondary segmentation. So it doesn't always just take one segmentation to get where you want to be. In some cases, you might run multiple segmentation algorithms. The main goal being finding that optimal segmentation for whatever your need is. And then the final example is this edge detection. So this is another non-geospatial example, just some pictures of peppers. And what you can see is we can set an algorithm that will go through and identify those regions within an image. I've created a transect there. They don't align quite the way they're supposed to, but imagine that both of those red lines were across the same area of the image, and that those red lines were the image transect below. So you can see there's this change in value. It's much brighter where that highlight on the pepper is, and that would correspond to this brightness, this kind of jump in values down below. And so we can use these types of discontinuities to identify boundaries within an image. It's similar to the spectral thresholding, but we're not identifying a specific value that we're cutting at. Instead, we're just looking for those discontinuities, and the discontinuities might not be the same spectral values. So as I said, region growing is the most common form of segmentation for GEOBIA, and we'll look in Saga how to do this. So I'm going to switch over to the Saga software, and if you guys have any questions, I do have the chat open so I can try to help as we go along too. Let's see. Oops, didn't mean to do that. We'll do segmentation first. Okay, so when you have Saga open, like many open software tools, the use of Saga can be a little confusing at first. It has a decently high learning curve to it. because it doesn't do things, at least for me, it doesn't do things the way that I'm used to having dealt with Esri and things like that. But the main overview for the software, this big darker gray area is where your map and your data is displayed. I have object properties open. If you don't see this screen here, the one that says properties, settings, and description, you can open that here at the window. Oops. Show object properties window. You'll probably want to do that as we're going through this. It says data sources. I close that because we aren't going to do anything with Postgres or any of that stuff. And then that gives you your manager window, a much larger area, which will be useful later on. And then we have a data window and maps. One confusing thing about using Saga is they have data and maps. Data will be the list of all of your data pieces. So for example, your images, your vector files will all populate here. You'll see them also over in maps if you put them on the map. When you're going through these, you'll see different properties over here in the properties box, depending on whether you're in the maps view or the data view. And that's where I find my most confusion is I'll be puttering away and think I'm in the maps view and I'm not, I'm in the data view, and it'll be confusing. So let's open an image. To open an image, you're going to go to geoprocessing. You'll note, you should note anyways, the geoprocessing tools here listed in this menu are also located here in the tools. So if you're used to working with Toolbox and ArcGIS, this might be the more familiar view to you. It really doesn't matter. As far as I can tell, the tools that I use here are exactly the same as the tools I use in the geoprocessing window. From the geoprocessing window, you're going to go to File, and then we're going to go down to Grid, sorry. So here's something about Saga that is a little different than Arc. So in ArcGIS, we typically, rasters are rasters. And we don't differentiate between grid rasters and satellite imagery. It's just raster. Unless you're using a specific satellite sensor like Landsat, then there are some specialized tools that are already pre-programmed for Landsat. But a grid is just a raster in this case. You can go down to Import Raster. Nope, I have my information. If you're ever need documentation about a tool, this info button is what that is. You'll find with Saga that a lot of the parameters don't have metadata attached to them, and I think that's just part of being an open source tool. Things aren't well documented. So hopefully you have the image that I provided. You're going to start with Files on the top and navigate to your image. So I have the same folder that you guys have, Saga tutorial image. You can open it. Now, it took me a long time to figure this out when I was first getting started with Saga, because I'm used to either directly having the software split the image for me, or knowing that I can double click and it'll let me select individual grids. You're going to want to make sure that your multiple band output is single grid. This is going to bring in the image as the individual bands for the image instead of a stacked band. And this is important when we get to the next step. You don't have to select from multiple bands because we're going to open all 4 of them. Okay, if you ever wonder whether something worked or not, a nice feature that Saga has is down here at the bottom. If it's worked correctly, the tool execution succeeded will pop up. If it's still working, usually you'll see a status bar. You won't always, but you'll know because the green tool execution succeeded won't have been up if it's still working. Okay, so if you open the data, you can see you have your grid system. and it has the properties for that grid, and then you have your 4 bands. The 4-band image is like most 4-band images. Your band 1 is your red, band 2 is green, band 3 is blue, sorry, and then band 4 is your NIR band, or near infrared. And I said it was important for us to bring them all in separately, and that's because if we go back up to geoprocessing, and then we go to imagery this time, we can go down to vegetation indices and slope base. So you have a number of different indices you can use, indices you can use. But if we go down to the vegetation one, you have even more, and we can see you can set the grid system. So that's the image we just opened. Your red reflectance band, so that's that band 1 I just told you about. Your near infrared, here's your band 4. And then we're going to use the most popular one, the normalized difference vegetation index. And you're going to select create. Now I know in most software packages, GIS packages, instead of something like create, you'd give a file name. Not how it works here, at least. Yeah, not how it works here. And then you can hit OK, and this should be a pretty quick process. Is everybody okay with that? Oops, no, let's chat. Okay, so hopefully that worked for everyone. I'm not seeing any calls for help on the chat. And you can see in our data view, we now have our 4 bands, plus, oh, I don't want that right now, plus we see a normalized difference vegetation index band. And if you double click on that, it's going to come up in your map window. And we'll talk about what this image shows in a minute. I put the break slide before I meant to, so we'll get to it in a minute. But in general, we'll just say that this orange region here is a lake. I mean, if you want, you could pull up the RGB image. And then the bright green is vegetation, and the bright white is beach sand. And we'll talk about kind of more about the composition of this location in a minute. Now, if you want to change anything about how you're viewing this band, you can go over here to these properties, and down here, this display and then colors is where you change it. So if you click on color type, you have single symbol, classified, or discrete, and you can do graduated color. And you can change the colors as well. So it's going to pull up something that looks like this, but if you go over here, you can change it to something that looks like that. And you always have to hit apply at the end. So now we're seeing the NDVI values using a single color ramp. The bright colors, or the bright white colors, now are kind of a brown, not brown, a bit darker, but the sandy water is really bright. You can see from the NDVI image, it's pretty clear where the different boundaries are between the beach, the water, and even you can see this like snake-looking road going through. If I zoom in down here. So this imagery is 1 meter imagery, if I remember correctly. You can see the roundabout, or where people park. You can kind of see a building footprint here, and another one here, a parking lot, and we'll see even more of that in a minute. So the next thing that I'd like you to do is we're going to go ahead and segment the image. We're going to actually do this twice. We're going to do it once now, and then we'll do it again when we start with classification, because I'll show you the 2 different classification methods. So if you go back down to imagery and segmentation, you'll see object-based image segmentation. Now this is why I asked for everybody to download 7.9. Prior to 7.9, this object-based image segmentation wasn't in this location. It wasn't available previously, and then has only become available here more recently. So if you don't have this correct version, you might not see this. When you open it, you're going to get a number of things to input. Here you can see a grid system again. We only have one image open, so it should only give you one thing. And then features. In Saga, features are the different bands of information. So we have bands 1 through 4 and the NDVI. For this segmentation, we're just going to use the NDVI. And then normalize is always a good option. And then you're going to create segments. So segments are polygons in a vector format that you can use for classification. And here's that region growing. Remember I told you you would create seed points, and those points would grow as regions. In this case, it's 2. So every 2 pixels you can have a seed point. And you can change your relationships, your neighborhood relationships, if you wanted to search in 4 directions or 8 directions. I'm going to do 8. You don't have to do that. And then if you want variance in feature space or position. In this case, feature space alone works great. You don't have to worry about space. And I'm going to leave everything else as the default. And we'll just run this. So click OK. This might take a little bit longer, especially if you decided to use more bands than just the NDVI. It'll slow down a little bit. I did have some issue with things being very slow on my non-work computer. So right now I'm on a computer that has 256 gigabytes of RAM, and it's running okay. You might have difficulties if you're running on a laptop with like 16 or 36 gigabytes of RAM. Okay. So tool execution succeeded, and if you look at your data view, you're going to see shapes. Shapes are the word that Saga uses for vector files, and you're going to see it's a polygon. It's polygons, and segments are the name of the file. If we click on that, we can see the object properties, and we can see we're going to do just single symbol. The best way, or the easiest way to view your results transparent. This will show you the outlines, but it won't fill them in. So then you can see the results of the segmentation as well as the image underlying it. Why isn't it showing? Oh, because we didn't put it in the map. Almost forgot. In order to be able to see it on the map, you actually have to add it. To do that, just double click on the segments file. You'll notice that the map is named after the first file that you opened in it, and voila. So now you can see the segmentation. Each of these polygons, let's see, so each polygon, you can see I highlighted that one in red, is one object. You can see also that the objects in general are being divided along spectral changes. So this is the point there where the sand meets the water. And if we zoom out, you can really, probably about at that resolution, you can see now we have a good definition along the shoreline. We have what looks like a rather continuously shaped road, and then the different bodies of water. These are all wetlands. And finally, you can see within the water even, we saw the variations, and those are represented very well. If we want to not show that, so if you want to just go back to the image, you can go up to Maps, and then just double click on Segments, and it'll remove it. This little asterisk in front of it shows that it's not visible at that moment. So voila. Okay, so now you know how to do segmentation. You might want to play with the segmentation. Fortunately, this image segments really, really well, but there's a lot of instances where you're not going to get such refined segmentations. So if you were to do this with a city scene, for example, you're going to have a lot of spectral confusion that you're going to have to play around with. So the impervious surfaces, rooftops versus roads, might be something that you have difficulty with. There are a couple of different ways around that. What you could do in some cases, you could segment out a portion of your image, create that object, mask out the rest of it, and then perform a segmentation on that second part. For example, here, if I wanted, I could merge together the different water pieces and then go back through and try to segment out the various pieces of vegetation afterwards. Okay, so switching back to the presentation. Voila. Okay, so this is the area of interest that we just looked at in the other other view. So from above, this is the point there. This is Lake Superior. If you're interested in where this is specifically at, it's right here in Munising, Michigan, in the Upper Peninsula. It's actually my hometown, so I know this location very well, and it helps with the identification process. And remember, I picked out 2 building footprints. You can see one roof here and the other roof there. Now, both of these building footprints work very well, or stand out spectrally because they're red. They're not impervious like what you might see in an urban roof, cement, sorry. And then you can kind of see some cars there. The cars, this wasn't taken at the same time that imagery was, so these aren't the cars that are in the image. And you can see along the beachfront there in the upper right-hand side, some vegetation. So that's some open grass next to the beach area. If I remember correctly, this image was actually taken across at a different year. So the year after or the year before, I don't remember which, of the image that you just segmented. The location is very dynamic. You'll see the beach move up and down this coastline, varying in width quite a bit. If you were to go to one of the land sat temporal viewer things, it changes quite a bit. It's why it's kind of interesting. The reason I picked it for this is because I've actually, my first independent research project was at this point when Iconos was really still new, and it's amazing to see how it's changed over the last 13 years, as much as that makes me seem old. So let's talk about the next aspect. Oh, well, I don't know how I was planning on doing this. So I thought this was going to go straight into classification, but this is basically walks you through the same things that are in that PDF. So the image that we have was the 4-band 1 meter resolution. This is that image in natural color instead of NDVI. You can see the 2 buildings right there. You can see though in this RGB colored image, it's difficult in some areas, especially down here, to see where the beach ends and the water begins. And so with some of the other imagery we've used, that's where we've had problems, is differentiating between water and very sandy, or beaches and water because of the sand. This is that NDVI image with the same segmentation details that we looked at that are in the PDF. This is shows the difference between the use of feature space plus position. So this is the alternative segmentation that we didn't do, and feature space only. So the spectral information only. You can see they vary quite a bit. Interestingly though, and the reason we picked only feature spaces is because if you look at that feature space plus position, there's some confusion there along the edge, like what I was just talking about, due to the very sandy nature of the bottom of the lake. Okay, this is where I was supposed to start with the segmentation walkthrough. So let's talk about classification. We'll talk about the 2 main types of classification that we use in Earth observation. I was going to try to do decision-based or rule-based classification, but it was very troublesome in the software, so I don't have that. But if anybody wants to explore that, I'm happy to talk to them offline through email and help them figure it out. So classification. If we think about the general process of classification, basically what we're trying to do is take some object and put it into a category based on its properties. For those of you that are experienced with Earth observation, you know we typically break it into 2 different categories, supervised or unsupervised. And our classifications for Earth observation are based on spectral information, and with object-based image analysis, we can integrate geometric properties such as size and shape. So there are a number of different methods of classification, both supervised and unsupervised. Unsupervised methods include clustering or k-means, as well as more sophisticated methods like neural nets. And supervised methods, probably the most common is a maximum likelihood. I know that was the first one that I learned when I was still a student, but there are other methods as well. And the basic difference between these are, with unsupervised classification, you're really letting the data make the classification for you. We'll do an unsupervised classification in a minute. And then a supervised classification, you're the one kind of in charge of setting up what the categories are. So we'll look at that some more in a moment, but yeah. Oops. And as I said before, there are other mechanisms for classification like decision trees or rule-based classification. When we talk about object-based classification, we have 3 parameters for assessing its goodness of fit for an application. The first is object fidelity. So how well do the objects that you're extracting match with reality? So if we're interested in extracting cars, for example, we want the car. We don't want the car plus the fire hydrant plus the sidewalk. We want to be able to model that car footprint in an accurate and precise way as possible. Accuracy, the quality of being correct. As I just said, we want an accurate representation, not only in the object's boundaries, but the object's location. And we'll talk about that a little bit when we get to accuracy assessment. And then finally, relevancy. So is the information that you're extracting relevant for the problem you're trying to solve? A best example of this is if you think about the hierarchical structure that we can create. So if you're interested in building footprints across Manhattan, it's probably not relevant to extract all of the air conditioning components and the rooftop gardens and all of the individual components that fall within a building footprint. That's probably more information than you need. So if what you want is the building footprint, you can generalize your data so that it better fits the problem at hand. Okay, so with that, we're going to step into the classification process. This time, I think what I'll do is walk you through it with the slides, and then we'll go into the software. I think when I was creating this, I was thinking of having both the PowerPoint slides and the software up at the same time, but I think it's easiest to go through the slides first. So the first thing you need to do for a classification problem is come up with your classification schema, or the way that you want to organize your information. As we talked a few seconds ago even, about the relevance of your classification, or the classes that you're using to the problem that you're trying to solve. So for the image that we just looked at, the same point, we're going to continue to use it. I have 6 different classes. So water, really there's 3 different types of water in the image. We have open water, so the deep dark water out in the channel, shallow water along the beach, and then we also have swamp. And you can see over here, I have 2 pictures from that site. The first is the North Beach area, so where that roundabout was. This is just off of there. And you can see we have some driftwood, and we also have, you can see the forest there in the background, and then you can see the water, and you can hopefully see in the water that there's variations in color depending on the depth of that water. So the very shallow regions here along the beach are very similar color to the beach sand, and then as you move to the deeper areas, it's kind of a teal blue. And then if you look at the image below, this is one of those swamp areas. And you can see the water here is this really dark brown, and that's because of the iron oxides in the water. So even though it's all water, the way that it's represented spectrally in the image varies quite a bit because of the underlying geology to it and the chemical composition. The second class I have is beach. So that's this open beach like what we see in the top image. There's also a lot of forbs and grasses. So I think in the initial image of the point that I showed you, kind of the oblique viewpoint, you could see that there's a lot of grasses and forbs growing in the sand itself. And there's also some regions on the point that are very sandy, and they grow blueberries very well. So shrubby type plants. We have forests that you can see in the top picture really well there, as well as the behind the bog there. The road, or the impervious surface. In reality, we have a couple of impervious surfaces because the road itself is made out of pavement, and then there are several parking lots that are gravel instead of pavement. And then finally, wetland vegetation. So in this bog image here, you can see that we have lots of bog plants and wetland plants. Oops. So the main way that we'll look at classification given what time it is and how long it does take for some of the stuff to process, we'll look at the unsupervised classification first and see how long it takes for everybody. I'm going to escape out of this. You're going to see that. Here we go. Okay. So for unsupervised classification, it's really straightforward, I think in any software, but especially in Saga. I'm going to close this segmentation. There we go. In the map, you can see that it's still available in the data. But if we look at if we go back here to Imagery, Segmentation, Object-Based Image Segmentation, and you'll note that Saga keeps the same parameters that you used in the previous segmentation, so you don't need to change anything. The only thing that I want you to change is this post-processing. So here we originally had none, so all it did was segment the image. Now we're going to let it do an unsupervised classification of the image. I'm going to change it from 12 to, let's try, I'm going to do 6 classes because I had 6 classes in my classification schema. Typically with an unsupervised classification, you want more classes than what you're aiming at, so that way you can combine them. It's easier to combine classes than it is to split them apart later. For the interest of time, I'm just going to use the direct 6 and we'll see how well they work. Okay, and then you can just hit OK and it's going to run. This isn't going to work very well because I just did it on NDVI and not the full image. We'll look at one other case of using unsupervised after this is done running. While it's running, I'm going to open back the slides. Okay. So while you guys have that hopefully figured out, I'll give you a minute before I continue, so that way if you're looking for anything, I don't want to get ahead of you too far. Okay, so hopefully you were able to execute that without any issue. You should get something that looked like this. Hopefully yours worked. Oh, mine's still running. In some cases, depending on the setup of the spectral information, you might get a lot of unclassified response. So in this case here we have 2 classes, the red class and the black class, and then all of the extra gray is unclassified, and that was because I selected the wrong band. What you want is something that looks like this. So in your segmentation, in this case here I used NDVI plus the other 4 bands, so the red, the green, the near infrared bands, and I got something that looks like this with a maximum number of clusters or classes of 10. And you can see that this still doesn't really match what we think of when we think about our classification. So we had talked about water, open grass, beach, sand, forest, wetland, and now I'm forgetting the last one. But even just looking at the water class, you can see that the segmentation and classification didn't do a very good job at pulling out all of that variation in water. So we have this open water, or it was really dark water, and then we have 3 dark water areas in the swamp. But then we see this mixture of kind of the orange, this dark orange, and then a lighter orange. But we see another lighter orange here around the swamp that, if we were to look at the image again, really is vegetation. It's not water by any stretch of the imagination. So there's some confusion there, and that's because, as I said before, the computer is really building up the classes based on spectral information without any guidance from us. I'm going to check and see. Yeah, it's still executing. We'll talk about, let's talk about supervised classification next. I'll walk you through it on the slides, and then we'll go back to Saga, and hopefully by then the unsupervised classification will have been completed. So supervised classification is a top-down process whereby you are the one telling the computer what the classes should look like. So in this case here, or in the files, if you downloaded the files from Google, in addition to the images, the 2 images, there should have also been a training shapefile. It's called, let's see. This one, Training Samples Saga. So if you have that, those are the training sites for this classification. I just randomly chose them. They are not proportional to the representation of them within the image. They were just random, really quick. Let's create some boxes to create a classification. And you can use those to classify as well. And you can see kind of some relics of those shapefiles in this image. So these weird box-looking things that are showing up, those are areas where those training sites were at, and they kind of just carried through the analysis process. In a supervised classification, you're going to create these training samples, and in creating those, you can do them directly in Saga. They do have a digitization tool. I used Esri because it was quicker and easier to do for me, but you can easily import shapefiles into Saga. Once you've done that, you then would take the segments that come out of your segmentation and merge them with the training classes. So that way the segments then have some of the segments or objects have assignment to some classes, and then the statistical classifier will classify the other objects based on their similarity to those pre-classed objects. Let's see if Saga's done yet. Yeah, Saga's not even coming up now. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to restart Saga since it's frozen. Yeah, if I can even get it to restart. Well, in all my preparations, I haven't had it do this to me. Okay. So I'm going to go back to Saga. I'm just going to get quickly caught up to where we're at. File, grid, raster. You can tell I've done this quite a bit in the last couple of weeks. Why is that not showing?
So, Rachel, while you upload that, we have a question about the image that you're using.
Mm-hmm.
So what kind of image is, and if this image is available for the public?
Yeah, definitely. So the image is from earthexplorer.usgs.gov. It is the USDA, so the U.S. Department of Agriculture National Aerial Imagery Program, or Agricultural Imagery Program, sorry. It's an aerial-based image. Why is this not working? What did I do wrong, guys? You can download it there. The other image, so there's the 1 meter image, which is the one that we're working on the analysis with. This is why. Is also available there. And then there's the 12-foot imagery that I also supplied, and that's also available there. I'm not completely sure the reason why the 1 foot 12-inch imagery was created. It was actually developed by a private company, I'm guessing for some sort of validation for the USGS. So you won't always find the 12-inch 1 foot imagery, but the NAPE imagery is available for the continental United States. It's flown every 2 years, and it's taken during leaf on. It's mostly used for agricultural purposes, or at least that's why it's funded. And people use it all the time, but it's free, which makes it a really good source of imagery for this. Imagery, segmentation, object-based image segmentation, objects. That's fine. Create. Hopefully that'll be fast. Yes, so that imagery is available. There's also a growing availability of some UAS data for sites through Earth Explorer. I really recommend Earth Explorer for finding free imagery. They're not the UAS, the drone imagery, isn't continentally available. It's definitely project-based, so I know there's some imagery for Wyoming, but there's probably other areas too. Okay. Voila. Okay. So here is the segmented image. It looks different than the last one because I didn't change any settings. So we have really tiny objects, but that's okay. So let's look at doing a supervised classification for this. Let's see if I can get my mind back on straight. The classification algorithms you're going to find under imagery, and you can see from this toolbox there's a variety of them. Those segmentation parameters that we were just looking at in the other one are here, but you can see segmentation here doesn't have the GEOBIA one. It doesn't have image object. And this is where I said pretty much everything is available in both places, but maybe not everything. If you're familiar with computer vision, there's some of the OpenCV algorithms available. OpenCV is a very powerful computer vision package, originally written, I think, in C++ or C# or C. I don't know. I get all three of those mixed up. I'm not a programmer. But those are available. If you look under classification, though, you can see we have the ability to create confusion matrices. We'll talk about in a little bit. The decision tree method, K-means clustering, which is an unsupervised method, And then we have different supervised classifications. So one of the interesting things that I found with this software is the supervised classification. You can do it on the polygons or the grids. So for object-based image analysis, obviously, maybe not obviously, we want to use those objects we just created as the classification inputs. But you might have, if you want to do a pixel-based, you could do that easily with the supervised for grids. So how to do it with shapes. If we go to our data, we can see we have our segments, but we don't have the training class data in it yet. So to import vector data, so a shapefile, for example, you're going to go to File, Shapes, and Import Shapes. Now, I have, on multiple occasions in creating this this workshop, lost this button. For some reason, I tend to go to import and then try to look for it over here because they have a bunch more import options here. And there's one called import shapes from XYZ, and there's also another one somewhere else that is import shapes from an LAS file, a LiDAR file. Those don't work. So just as a reminder, something easily to forget, import shapes. And you go to Files. I'm going to import this training samples shapefile that I created. And geometry type, automatic. So it should know it's a polygon. Okay. If I double click it, I can add it to my map. And all of a sudden, all those training sites are popped up. If we zoom in, I want to show you why those artifacts in the other image were showing up. So I can go over here and change it so you can see it through it. And then I'm going to create the boundary as a bright, let's do purple. That doesn't show up very well. There we go. So if you look at the way that I created these training samples, because I just did them and I didn't take into consideration the objects that are there, these objects are getting split. So you can see where my cursor is, there's a couple of objects, in fact, that have been split into multiple objects. And because of that, the classification, it creates artifacts within the results. So I would highly suggest, if you were to do this, you create the training samples from these polygons. I didn't do it just because it was quicker to create some boxes than go through and digitize all these little objects. But that's how to get over that problem. Sorry, the sun's going down now. I really can't see. So to do a supervised classification, you're going to have to do a couple of things first. The first thing can't see. The first thing that you need to do is to merge, or union in this case, the two object layers. So this training data along with the segmentation. So if you go down to shapes, or here, it's easier to do in the tools. So if you go to the tools menu here, you go down to shapes, you can see there's a bunch of different tools available. If you go to polygons, and then there's this union tool down at the bottom. Oops. We're going to do segments and training samples, and we're going to create a new object. And we're going to say, don't split parts. Now when we go back to the data view, you can see we have this new number 3 here. So they're numbered in the order you create them. The newest one as always has the higher number. And this new segments, if we add it to view, now we have a layer, and you can see that these individual polygons now have been split by the other object. But if we go and we click on one of them within the training, we see that it has this class, water, assigned to it. If we click on one of the objects outside of that training, we see that it doesn't have a class associated with it. So when we perform the classification, then it's going to use the spectral information from these objects that have the class water assigned to them. There's another one. And use that to test the non-classified objects and assign them to a category. Sorry, I'm losing my voice. So the next thing that you want to do is you're going to go to Imagery, and you go back to Classification. Where did it go? That's not, okay. Strike that. We're going to go to the Tools box and go to Imagery and Classification. So this is what I mean by this software takes a bit of getting used to, and things are kind of all over the place. And we're going to go to Supervised Classification, and we're going to go for shapes, because what we're really going to classify is the shapes themselves. Actually, I skipped an important step. I'm sorry. The next thing we need to do is actually extract the spectral data in order to classify. So if we go back down to shapes, we do shape grid tools, we can add the grid values to your shapes. You're going to set your shapes to that set that we just created, so number 3. And then you're going to create your new objects, and this will have the classes, the unclassed, and the spectral information. And then you're going to select your object information. So I'm going to just take all 5 bands that we have. You're going to click OK. Takes a minute maybe, but this is another tool that moves pretty quickly. And now, if we add that, it looks the same, but if we were to click on it, there's your attributes. So it's the class water. It has these spectral attributes, and it has those shape characteristics. So now if we go to Tools, Imagery, Classification, and then Supervised Classification on Shapes, we're going to do the last one for shapes. We're going to select the features. So now when we pull up features, instead of getting those individual bands, we're getting all of the properties of those objects. And I'm just going to select the individual bands. I'm going to go ahead and normalize them. And then I can select what is my training class. And that's that value of class. And it's going to create a classification for me. I'm going to use maximum likelihood. You can see there's different classification methods available. And then I'm just going to hit OK. Now this, see, this classification didn't take nearly as long as the unsupervised classification, and it didn't crash my system. So you can see one of the benefits of maximum likelihood has already shown itself. We'll go ahead and bring up the results. So it's going to save it as a polygon file. So again, it'll be under Shapes. We'll double click it, add it to our map. You can see in the maps now we have layer 5, which is our maximum likelihood output. And to visualize it, we can see, boy, those are some awful colors they picked. We'll change that. We can see the classes represented here in the legend. And we can go to the settings. And we'll do classified. We're going to use the individual classes. Let's that. Oh, I bet you, hang on. Yeah. always helps to zoom out so that you can see the entire image to see that the classes are working instead. There we go. So now you can see with the supervised classification, because we had some of that variability, especially in the water, represented within the training classes, our immediate output is much better. So I specifically oversampled the water regions. If we look at the, let's see, it always takes a second. Yeah, so you can see where the training samples were. And I oversampled the water areas so that I got as much variability as possible in that training sample set. So then I had the images, had that part of the image pretty well set, where in this unsupervised, the computer didn't know that that spectral variability was within the class. It considered it as a reason to separate into multiple classes. So that's supervised classification. In order to clean up your results, you'd want to use the dissolve tool. I believe that's in the PDF that you guys have. But if you go to shapes and you go to polygons, polygon dissolve here, you can dissolve based on fields. So we can select our result. We can select our dissolve field, which would be the class NR is our class result. And okay. And then known, there we go, keep boundaries. Well, let's do that. I didn't think this was a very slow process, but maybe it is. So while that's doing that, we'll go back to the slides, and I'll kind of just finish up with classification so we can quickly talk about accuracy assessment before the end, because I know we're running out of time. So once you dissolve the boundaries, you're going to get something that looks like this image here. So you have some artifacts in this image, but for the most part, water is all aggregated into one polygon, and then the ponds are one polygon and things like that. This is the comparison. On the left side, you can see that was the result from an unsupervised classification, and on the right is the results from a supervised classification. Now, we also see the two different representations. The left is a grid or a raster. The right is a polygon file that's been colored. Something that I didn't show you here, mostly because the computational requirement is kind of heavy, and it would take longer than the time we have, is the use of morphology in classification. So remember I said that the geometric properties of classification are particularly useful for object-based image analysis. And there are a number of different geometric measures, indices that you can use to characterize those objects. We do have a tool, Shapes Polygons. There's a link in the bottom here that gives an overview of it, that you can calculate those morphological metrics. For example, you can calculate the area perimeter relationships. There's a number of different ways to relate those. Sphericity, the diameter area relationship, and the direction of maximum diameter. All of these different instances or different metrics can give you information to help differentiate things. So I just put two arrows up here on this image. This image is the direction of maximum diameter. So this is going to give you a measure of angular relationship, and you can see, especially in this beach polygon, it goes a certain way. It goes to the northwest, and in comparison, these ponds are shaped, they go to the northeast. And so the color is based on the metric value. So you can kind of see that might be useful, especially in some of the geologic hazard applications like landslides, or maybe in river morphology. The direction might help in distinguishing between different types of objects. So the last thing that I wanted to talk to you all about was accuracy assessment. Accuracy assessment, if you've been doing Earth observation for a long time, you know the standard method of confusion matrix. And confusion matrices are used in object-based image analysis, but because we're analyzing objects and we're not just analyzing pixels, there are some difficulties that can arise. First of all, we end up having different types of accuracy assessment. We can have thematic accuracy, so are the classes correct? But we also have to think about spatial accuracy. So how accurate is that segmentation to the objects that we're trying to segment? We can also break this down even further, and we'll look at an example of that in a minute. But we can think about the same types of errors. We can think about overall accuracy. We can talk about omission errors, what features have been forgotten from a category, or commission, what features are incorrectly classified, your type 1, type 2 errors. There's a ton of different terminologies that we use for accuracy that I think is pretty generally used across most disciplines dealing with classification. So let's talk about segmentation accuracy first. So the first thing we want to think about is object optimization. In this first example of the horses, you can see that there are multiple objects per horse. We would call that an over-segmentation. So we split the object into more parts than that object is. In contrast to that, you can see in the other image, which is the site we've just been working on, that it's under-segmented. So that beach is under-segmented. You can see kind of the split where the beach and the water are, but we've grouped them into the same area. So in both cases, those would be unoptimized segmentation results. And we want to go through and try to fix those. You could do that in a couple of different ways. You could go through and completely resegment everything. You might go through and subset the image and only resegment the parts that are over or under segmented. Some other challenges. It's difficult when you're doing an object-based accuracy assessment because the objects that you're using if you're doing a change analysis, for example, so let's say you're looking at time 1 and time 2, the objects are likely to either physically move or spectrally move. So you might have an object that moves from place A to place B, or it might be in a shadowed region now, or there might be some new atmospheric effect. So you're not guaranteed that that object's exactly the same. So it makes it difficult to measure from point 1 or time point 1 to time point 2. It's also object-based image analysis and accuracy assessment is also more complex because we're working with objects. I think we'll look at an example here. So we think about sampling design. When we're doing pixel-based image accuracy assessment, we're looking really at the accuracy of individual pixels. Those pixels are all the same size and they're all the same shape and they're distributed equally across the image. The classes might vary, but then we just weight the sampling based on that area. When we do an object-based image analysis, we aren't just assessing pixels, we're assessing the objects. Those objects have different sizes and they also have different properties, spatial properties, which make it a little bit more complicated. So in order to design a sampling method that is accurate for this type of analysis, it's best to use something that's non-spatial. So you might select randomly from a table instead of based on the spatial locations within the image. You might do some sort of a regular sampling where you're breaking that image into a large grid. Or you might do some sort of a stratified sample based on the areas of the polygons. So in our case, we had a large sample or a large aerial coverage of water. So we'd want to weight the number of points that we're using for accuracy assessment or objects that we're using for accuracy assessment based on that aerial coverage. If you're looking at, we talked about object detection. So, and in those cases, we don't have full thematic coverage. We have points within the space, and there's a whole different set of metrics for that can be found. I put at least one paper in the PDF that has good instructions for how to do that. The example of why it's so difficult is provided in this image. If we look at area-based versus count-based, in the first example, both methods show the 66% accuracy because 1/3 of the pixels as well as 1/3 of the areas or the bars are incorrectly classified. But then if we look at the second and third examples, we see the discrepancy whether we're using a pixel, an area or individual points or individual pixels as that representation. Another way that it gets complicated is if you want to measure other aspects of accuracy besides class accuracy. Lazzaro's 2014 paper presented other dimensions of accuracy that could and should be addressed, including the shapes. So how accurate is the shape represented in the classification compared to the shape in reality? The tree crown example we looked at the beginning is a good example of where that would be important. Edge and position, both of these have to do with how accurate our classification is spatially. So is that location in geographic space precise and accurate compared to real geographic space? Same thing with boundaries. If your spatial accuracy is off, it might not be that important, but in other cases it could be very important. We won't do an accuracy assessment in Saga, but I will show you really quickly what it would look like. There's two different methods of accuracy assessment. The first one is a grid-to-grid comparison, and the second is a grid-to-polygon. In the grid-to-grid comparison, you have a reference image and your classification image you're comparing. In the grid-to-polygon, you have your resulting classification as a grid, and you have your reference data as polygons or points. The biggest key for doing this in Saga is making sure that the classification values you use are the same in your result and in your output, or your output and your reference. You can see over here in my original reference, I had used semantic descriptive classes, beach, forest, open grass, and then redefine those as numbers 1 through 6. That's because Saga's default is to use numbers, not verbal descriptions for classes. I then had the classes that resulted from an unsupervised classification, so 2, 0, 3, 4, and then I related those back to the verbal classes, and I used the Saga classification, grid polygon comparison, and changed the values and the lookup values to match those classes that I'd used before. And then that looks like this in the results. So then I can have class 1 and class 1, etc. I have the semantic information there as well. And I ended up with a very poor classification, only based on 25 points, but still of only 48%. This was one of those unsupervised classifications that we saw didn't really work very well. You can see here, class 3 grass and class 4 roads had no correct classifications according to the points that I picked. Had I picked another set of points or a larger set of points, we could have seen the accuracy change, but for this specific classification, that's what we ended up with. So hopefully that helps. I think that was the last slide. Yeah. So that is everything I had for you. I'm happy to take questions. Yeah, that's still going even, so. If anybody has questions, I'm happy to answer them. If you need to ask.
Okay. Chicos, ¿tienen preguntas? Sí. A ver, no sé si tengan preguntas. Somos 26 participantes, bueno, 24, ¿verdad? Que estamos a Rechemio. No sé si existen más preguntas, aparte de la que comentaron acerca de la imagen. A ver, creo que sí tienen algunas preguntas. Vamos a ver. I think there are some questions in the chat. I will try to translate it. I think that Yolanda Solis is asking that if the NDVI are in the rectangle.
Yep.
I'm sure. Okay. If the values from the NDVI are in the rectangle, and if that values were the one that you use for, I mean, the image used to classify.
Yep. So within these purple polygons, the spectral values of the NDVI, the red, the green, the blue, and the near infrared bands, I used all of them. You could just select the NDVI. For this case, it doesn't result in quite as clean of a classification, but you can select any of those bands within the image.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. No sé, Yolanda, me está diciendo que sí, utilizó esos. No sé, aquí también Lucrecia ya contestó en el chat que sí, utilizó el NDVI y también el RGB NDVI. Ok, no sé si tengan alguna otra pregunta, chicos.